craft and the exercises people do, but normally that's spread out over like a week or even, as in the most famous genre workshop, Clarion West, over 6 weeks. And yeah, I don't think it makes much sense to do like that kind of format since we're here just for like a one-off session. So I think that what would make more sense would be for you to like bring up questions that you have. Questions could be anything about the craft, about problems you've faced when you try to write. If you have questions about world building, perhaps integral part of genre fiction. If you have questions about how to bring together the problems of exposition in genre fiction, common issue, while not info dumping. These are all problems all of us face while writing. So I think it makes more sense to do it that way, where like folks who have questions or thoughts that they want to share can raise them, and then I can address those if that's something that's possible for me to address, and you can have a discussion about those things, and then following which I can just give you my contact address, and if you have follow-up questions or other ideas, you can just drop me an email, and we can carry on the conversation after the workshop. But I don't think it makes sense for a lecture, in a one-off thing, because that's really not, I think, helpful. So yeah, I mean, I just like just have an open house, and anyone wants to start, like any yes, you can start. Yeah.
So I'm Arjun.
Yeah.
I'm a PhD student in public policy group. So actually, I like writing, and in fact, I mean, I try to capture everything. I mean, whatever I'm saying, if I'm somewhere, I'm writing travelogue or something. I'm walking in the campus, so I observe something, and I try to write basically. Maybe not in a very not in a very story format, but like poetic format or something. But I don't know, I mean, how to write something which maybe attract for a broader audience or something. I mean, for example, I write most of the things in Hindi. So in fact, I wrote in 2022. I wrote a travelogue. I visited different Indian states, so I wrote a travelogue in Hindi, and I got best prize and 10,000 rupees by IIT Gandhinagar basically. So I mean, why I am including that? I mean, I used to think that I write bullshit, but people are kind of reading that things, and whenever I am reading, because I'm not able to put in front of you anyone, like even if there is a Hindi audience, so if the person is reading my writings, there would be some Bhojpuri elements, like the very native kind of elements, and which I intentionally don't want to keep outside my writing. So that is one of the another aspect I found, that how I can work on it, and whether writing in English would be only aspect, because whenever I'm writing in Hindi, so I'm able to inculcate and come out of the nuances, or very minute thoughts which to understand in English I have to translate in my mind, but if I'm writing in Hindi it would be in a flow. So how can maybe from a travelogue I can write a fictional story kind of things, or maybe novel kind of things? So if you can enlighten that.
Yeah, I think that the two things here, right? So one is that, so what you're saying is that your writing is quite specific to experience. So you experience something, and you represent that in your writing. So the first question that I think is worth asking is that what part of that experience would be of interest to someone who does not share your very specific life history, right? And that's how you move from a personal piece of writing, which could be a diary entry, a journal, a memoir, an account of your travels, to something that is, a work of fiction, or a work that is meant to be read by someone beyond you and your immediate circle. So I think the first thing is to ask yourself what elements of what you have seen would be something that would interest a reader who does not know you, and a reader who will know you only through your text, right? It could, for example, be in a travelogue. It could be an experience that you have, an interaction with someone that has a human element to it, which is something that could be read and enjoyed by people much outside of your circle. So say like you lost your bag and then it was found in a very interesting way and given back to you, and that's the stuff of the story, right? So just keep in mind that the reader will only know you through your text. So you have to, in a certain sense, obviously your writing will come from the stuff of life, right? So it will come from experience. You have to find a way to remove from that all which is something that is so specific to you that nobody else really would be able to understand or appreciate that. And what you have left then is the work, or the text, or in our case, the piece of fiction. I think your other question I sensed in your comment was just the question of language and what language to write in. And here again, everyone who starts writing for or writing beyond their own context always has an audience in mind, right? So the first question you want to ask yourself is who is the audience you're writing for, and what is their context and where do they come from, and then that will answer your question about language, right? So if you want to write for an audience that really shares your cultural context, which might be a more limited audience, then you will write in Hindi along with the Bhojpuri elements mixed in. That's fine. If you want to again reach people who don't share your immediate context, then you will choose the language that is more accessible, in which in our case in India, because of our unique context, happens to be English. So, and yeah, like it is always natural that in the course of writing in a language that is not your own, something will be lost. That is inevitable. So it's not something that is unique to you. So whenever someone tries to write in a language it's not their language of thinking in, something will obviously be lost, because there's some things that are organic to a language, but you have to accept that as the price that you pay for greater reach, and that's just natural. So I wouldn't worry about that too much.
I have just like a specific question only about genre
Yeah,
fiction.
which is
So I wanted to ask about like character building or
Yeah.
character exposition or their relational dynamics in a genre fiction plot, because
Yeah.
again, having to balance exposition and having to balance a plot where so much is happening and there is like so much action and change and all of that, but still having characters that are strong enough that don't get flattened by that plot, where they're not disposable and their interiority isn't disposable. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, that is a very interesting question, and there are many different, I think, answers or approaches you can take. When I started writing, this is many years ago, there were actually like these sample questionnaires that were there on the internet, which had like 100 questions about your character, like starting from like the color of their eyes, the color of their hair, to their birth, growing up and so on. And it was a little funny because these were like really detailed, and a lot of that will never feature in the novel. But underlying that was, I think, an important idea, which is that you need to know your character really well to start with, right? So, and the questionnaires are just a way to get there. The way for you to know your own character really well. So I think start with that. So first you should like start with understanding your character, the character you're creating, a lot of which will not feature in the final story. But it's important for you to know, who they are, like what they're like, what their context is, and so on. And in fact, here fan fiction often helps, because often in fan fiction you have to create like a bio, first for your character. So those of you who write genre fiction, it's always good to always also write fan fiction, because it gives you like a training ground for writing. But yes, I think the first thing is to know your character very, very well. Start with that. Then I think like there's a question of, well, what kind of novel are you writing, or story, right? Now, because the extent to which you explore your character will depend upon the nature of the story. What I mean is that there are some stories, and there's nothing wrong with this, where the bulk of the work is being done by, well, the central idea of the story. What compels or what hooks your reader is the nature of that idea. So in the morning session, for example, I talked about Asimov's story Nightfall, where the premise is that you have one planet surrounded by like 6 suns, so there's never any nightfall. In 2000 years, once it happens that the suns are on the other side of the planet, there is nightfall, society reacts in a very violent way. What is driving that story is this basic idea, that for the first time in 2000 years, human beings will see the stars. And that is really what captures the imagination of your reader. In that kind of a story, the characters are not irrelevant, but they take a bit of a backseat. Right? So you need to focus a lot more on the way the idea drives the story. And in the course of that, often it is the idea which will determine the character. Right? So you will need to have certain kinds of characters who are well placed to then take the idea forward. So in this case, you have like a historian, you have someone who's been researching, like what happens previous time and so on. There is a risk there, which is a risk that you see in I think some of the older novels, where the characters basically become vehicles for ideas, right? So they become completely just carriers of different ideas. They become carriers of different points of view, and their interactions then become a clash of ideas. You want to avoid that, because then that is not a good story, right? But at the same time, the burden on you to really have deeply compelling characters is somewhat less if your story is one that's being driven by a very, very compelling premise. The other kind, of course, is the story where the characters do the work, where it's the individuals and the people and their interactions that drive the story. And here, I think there are 2 or 3 things you can do. One, and I think like this works quite well for me, is to ask yourself that here are these characters of mine. How would they react or respond in the situation that I'm putting them in, right? And to really think that through first, because obviously, again, in genre fiction, you are dealing with fairly extreme situations, right? Like you don't normally have slice of life SF. You do have Becky Chambers, right? You do have slice of life SF, but most of SF is actually going to put your people, your character, under some significant stress, right? And they will be in situations that are quite stressful in different ways. And so the question to ask yourself is, how would this character respond to the situation of stress? Would they, for example, have a crash out? Would it activate some past trauma of theirs? Are they dead calm? Is the whole thing like to respond in a very, very sort of ice cold way? Is that hiding some deeper trauma, right? Or is it like just the way they are? So to ask yourself, like, how would they respond in situations, will of course make you know them better, but ultimately that is how the audience will get to know them, right? So your reader will know, or will come to know the character through the situations you put them in. Again, keep in mind that this is not mid 20th century fiction where you can spend a chapter telling your reader about the interiority of a character, right? So a lot of old fiction, there'll be a whole chapter saying, here is so and so, they were born to this family, they felt this way about their life, and that is how you acquaint your reader with the character. That no longer works. Nobody will publish that story anymore unless you're like a big person. So you can't do that way. But the way you do it then is to essentially bring your audience in touch with the characters through the situations that they are in, and that's how their personalities reveal themselves, and that's how the audience will come to care about the character. One final thing I'll add here is, of course, that a lot of fiction, it's not just genre fiction, they will progress through dialogue, right, or conversations between your characters. And here's where something that Ursula Le Guin said many years ago, I think, is just evergreen wisdom, which is the ear test, right? So when you've written dialogue, speak it out, right? Go to a mirror if that's what works for you, and read out, what you've written. For dialogue, it works very well, but also, in fact, even the rest of it. Your ear will not lie, basically. It'll tell you if something is off. It'll tell you if it's working. It'll tell you if the dialogue, feels like a reasonable representation of the way people talk. Obviously, you're not meant to be exact about the way people talk, because then there's no point in writing fiction, right? You can just record a conversation. But is it like organic, and does it feel natural in terms of how they talk? You can really know it a lot better if you read out your writing to yourself and see how it sounds. And again, like a lot of, and this is the way human beings live, right? Like a lot of our personalities are developed in relation to others. We don't exist as islands. And similarly in fiction and in genre fiction too, again, you will make your readers care for characters through the way they relate to each other. And then that therefore becomes a very important part of the novel. So if your protagonist, do they have close friends? Are the kind of people who have close friends? How do they relate to their close friends? How do they relate to their lovers? People they are with in relationships. How do they relate to their enemies? To their opponents, to hierarchy, people in authority. So each of those interactions will tell you something about the character and will again make the reader care. So you will develop a lot of that through imagining the kinds of relationships that your characters will be in the novel's context, and then asking yourself how would they respond in that relationship, right? And that again will build them up. So over the course of a whole novel, you'll have situations, relationships, and so on. And what you want is by the end of the novel, or at least like midway through it, a fairly clear picture of your character will emerge for your reader without you ever having told them this is who this person is and this is how they got here, to the point where then the reader will begin to care about what happens to them, and that's how the second part of a novel will then sort of hook them. Again, no prescriptions here, but I think that's normally what I find works. Does that answer your question, or you have any follow-ups on that? Or okay, yeah. Hardest part, I think, care for the character is, I think, one of the hardest parts, specifically in a plot-driven genre like science fiction. Yeah, there's something.
Hi, I'm Shomo.
Yeah.
I try to write science fiction and fantasy in both English and Bengali. I have two questions for you. Both of them are mainly structural.
Yeah.
The first thing is, I've been seeing Brandon Sanderson's videos on. He teaches how to write. There he talks about promise, progress, and payoff. Promise and payoff, I can understand.
The three act.
Yes.
Three act.
I would like to hear your opinion about the part progress.
Yeah.
And how it helps to build conflict.
Yeah.
This is my first question.
Yeah.
And the second is the brainstorming process in sci-fi, particularly sci-fi.
Yeah.
How to come up with new ideas, striking ideas that can hook the audience and tell a meaningful story.
Can you just clarify what you mean by progress for the rest of the people?
As far as I have understood it, a story contains three parts. It begins with promise that it will, at the end, it will give you an explosive kind of end. And at the last part, the payoff part, there Sanderson gives often Sanderlands. The story kind of gives us an explosive ending, a climactic ending. The middle part is where the problem arises. The progress part. How these characters go on a journey and how they end in that position. I'd like to have your opinion on that. Please.
So I'll take the that's the easier question to answer. Brainstorming in science fiction you have to read, right? So, I get a lot of my ideas from just reading. So one thing that I think that, of course, you read other writers, you read people in the field, because you'll get a sense of what are the, questions people are grappling with in the field, what kinds of writing, is, and often you'll get so for example, I have a forthcoming story in Interzone magazine where one of the premises is that there are actually the class of people you can transpose your pain onto, so they can relive your pain for you. which is inspired by an Alistair Reynolds novel. Not the same idea, but something vaguely there. So I was like, oh wow, okay, like this could be interesting, and then you explore that on your own. I think reading a lot, and not just reading in your field, but I think also in science fiction, reading non-fiction a lot, right? So I, for example, have, and I haven't written stories yet on this, but there's this book called Entangled Life, which you may have come across, on the world of fungi, right? And that you read that book, and you will get 10 ideas for a novel. In fact, Star Trek Discovery, right, has a whole plot device on the mycelial network we use to travel space. In fact, Entangled Life, the book has refers to a very famous fungologist called Paul Stamets, and actually he was an advisor for Star Trek, and they have a character named Stamets in that book. So, and then I read this other book, for example, called Other Minds, which is about the octopus intelligence. That will give you like 10 ideas. In fact, this really good book, which one of my favorite novels called The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor, he's clearly read that book because he has sentient octopi. It's very interesting. So I'd say that if you want to write science fiction, read science. And I don't mean like you don't have to read like neurology of the octopus like a paper, right? Like, of course, no. If you're that invested, then it'll give you even more insight. But just like reading science books, reading good like science exposition books, I think is really good, because like the world has all kinds of wonders, and so much of your ideas will come from actual reality, like just and like when you read like a Reynolds novel, you can see that he's taking his stuff from our world, just like genetic engineering, things like that. So much of it you can see the base is something that's happening here, and of course then the imagination has to like play its part. I think like I'd say like definitely read like in your areas of interest, and you will get ideas there, and then talk to like have writing groups, because like writing is now thought of as a solitary enterprise, as is reading. But I was in fact just reading this book by Alejandro Zambra, which I mentioned in the morning, where he talks about how writing and reading were never meant to be solitary activities. It's always they're meant to be like groups in communal, right? So like you don't read, like you sing the story, like you're in a group, and in many ways we have lost that thing of like just talking about ideas with our friends. So I'd say have that, like have a group of people with whom you can just like bounce off ideas, and that really helps. As far as brainstorming goes, I think like that. And also I think like just one thing is be aware, because ideas will sometimes come in at the weirdest of places, like in the shower, when you're falling asleep. And it happened to me a few times, and it's very annoying now, because I'm lazy and like I'll remember this, and then I don't do that. And recently, the novel I'm working on, the sequel to my last novel, The Sentence, like there was a chapter which I had a sense of what I want to put in that, and I opened a folder in my Scrivener file, and I was like, I'll remember this, and now I have a blank folder and I have no idea what was in my mind, and I'm like, okay, why do I have this like extra folder in chapter 5? What was in my mind, chapter 5, right? So point being that you have the idea, write it down immediately. Like don't be lazy and say, oh, I'm in the shower, like I'll get to it. I'm falling asleep, I'll remember it in the morning. Just at that moment, like write down the idea in some way. Your first question on promise, progress, and payoff. So I think like first thing to note is that, and I think Sanderson himself says this, rules are not prescriptive in writing, right? So it's not that you follow the rules and like you will create like a good novel, nor is it that if you don't follow them you will not create a good novel, right? There are the guidelines of how people respond to stories. So I think that's one thing. The second thing I'd say is just as a prefatory remark, is that not every story has to be driven by conflict, right? So if you read Becky Chambers' work, award-winning work, very popular, her science fiction is not driven by conflict in the way that we normally think of conflict. So conflict, of course, conflict gives you a very good hook for like your readers, but you don't have to have conflict in the novel, right? So it's like, again, it's a helpful thing, but it's not mandatory. And none of this is mandatory. But like having said that, I think like progress is like the hardest part of the novel, and I think like a lot of it is. So I once read this piece of advice, in just like online thing. It was called the get there, thing, which is that okay. So at time t, your characters are at place A, and the next like scene requires them to be at place B. That's the next scene, right? And we get into all kinds of tangles about getting them from place A to place B. And we're like, okay, are they walking, something else? And we end up spending pages of like very dreary, stuff of people getting from place A to place B. Okay, for Tolkien writing LOTR, that's part of the charm, right? So like this walking for days is, is part of your thing. But we are not quite there yet, and nobody will want to read us writing about pages of walking. So there, actually, the advice was that just like cut that, right? So your reader will like fill in the gap for themselves. So it's fine to have them at like place A, right, and to have that scene, and then to have them at place B, and just to have one line which connects that. Your reader will like fill in the gap. You don't have to show the reader how they got there. It's fine. And it's a little hard to sort of process in the beginning because how is it possible? How did they get there? But that's fine. Like just like don't spend time on getting your characters from place A to place B. That could be a physical place or even like a temporal place, right? Like don't spend time doing that because you don't actually need to. That was one thing. The second is so I think like one thing that people do well is to have, so of course you have the overarching conflict in the novel, right? And I'm assuming that your novel is one that runs on conflict. So you have the overarching conflict in the novel, but that is not the only conflict. You will have a number of like smaller conflicts which connect to the bigger one, and they are what propel the plot forward in the course of the novel. So you have your final payoff, you have your initial promise, but you have like many small payoffs happening throughout the novel, right? And I think that's what you do. And I mean, this is a totally different sort of medium. One set of media I found does this very well is Chinese. Sorry.
The web series also runs on this pattern.
Well, yeah. But one thing I found doing, one set of like things I found do it again and again very well is Chinese fantasy web series, which again is a very niche interest. They're called wuxia or xianxia, so Chinese martial arts sort of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that kind of thing. But they have and you'll see this pattern after a while, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. They will have, and I'm not saying to adopt this because it's obviously very specific to like the kind of thing they're doing. They will have like a primary villain, right? You won't even see the primary villain until like episode 20, right? So it's a 40 episode series. In the first 20 episodes, they will be dealing with like a secondary villain, right? You will find out around episode 20 after they have defeated the secondary villain. Actually, he was working for the big one, right? And then suddenly you propel the story into the next phase, which is like the actual real villain, right? So you're thinking throughout that this is the real fight, and then you find out suddenly this is actually one part of a much bigger fight. So and it really works, it works very well to really keep you hooked. So in any like novel length work, you will need to find ways in which you set up smaller scale conflicts or whatever you want to call it, which then link back up to the overarching one, because you can't sustain a whole novel just on like one plot thread. The risk there then is that then you have multiple side quests, people get bored, all that. That's the problem. But you ultimately, what really works is that you have your main thread, but then within that you set up like these smaller ones which link back to that, and that really takes you from like the beginning, the promise to finally the payoff. One final thing I'll say is that, and this is like a very very like tricky thing. So I'm not saying you have to do it or but it's worth experimenting with. Sometimes denying payoff can be as interesting a way to end a novel than actually the actual payoff. So not every novel needs to have like a neat ending. There can be novels and there can be stories where you set it up, right, and then you sort of end without the climax. So, I can't think of something offhand which is an example of this, but at least in some of my work, like I try and do that consciously, because sometimes you want the reader to actually work for the ending themselves, right? And to actually, you want them to ask themselves, what kind of ending do I want? Or what kind of ending makes most sense? You don't want to make it easy for them as well, right? Or like just give them something on a platter. So yeah, again, this is like Gary Wolf once in a review said that sometimes you want to strangle the writer who does this sort of thing, because like where is the ending? But if you do it well, it can be very, very interesting. I think some Asimov work does that. In the Foundation series, like a couple of novels end at a point where you're like, okay, I've not gotten the ending, the clean ending I wanted, but that's kind of the point, right? Some things don't have a clean ending, some things don't have any ending at all, and so payoff is the easy way, and it'll give you like a sure shot, like reaction, and yes, that's sort of like that will be something good. But if you're really feeling adventurous and you want to experiment, sometimes you can try and see what will happen if I don't give my audience, the payoff. Yeah. They're just called Wuxia and Xianxia, like Wuxia. Yeah, so the Untamed is the legendary like series. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Japanese mangas, most of them, they also have this kind of villain thing, that there is a new story arc and new villain is coming on, who is much more powerful than previous one.
Yeah.
And they just keep happening every, like in Dragon Ball Z, those kind of thing, Yeah,
again, so I would say like be a little careful. Don't make it like a constant thing of like villain coming, next villain. Not that. But like sort of making your readers believe that this is the primary conflict, and then actually showing them like the real thing is happening under that surface is a very effective technique as well. Yeah.
So about character focused work, how do you prevent a character from sort of burning out?
Can you explain what you mean by burning out?
In a sense, you use him for a lot of points, and by the time you get to the center of the story, you're like, I don't know what else to do with the character. And if you as a reader are uninterested, as a writer are uninterested, the readers will also feel that. So how do you prevent that, or how do you revive interest actually?
Yeah, no, I think like this is like, here the answer is very simple. You have to have multiplicity of characters in your books, right? So I think like what you're referring to is a problem in novels that are dominated by like one character. And I'll give you an example. In the science fiction book club that I'm in Delhi, we read this book called I Who Have Never Known Men a couple of months ago, which was very polarizing. You know that, right? You were there, very polarizing book. And one of the issues I found with that was that there was literally, it was like one character, and everybody else was like just there, like NPCs basically, right? And it is very hard to sustain interest in like one person's interiority for the whole novel. So I think that for me, really what works is by ensuring that, and this is why for me some of my favorite novels are like at least 2 points of view, right? So you have like chapter 1 like X point of view, chapter 2 like different, or even 3. Like beyond 3, it's a little hard to like sustain that. But having like a diverse cast basically, will really help to ensure that you aren't burdening like one character with like all the work, and they remain fresh. So I think that's just like a pretty fail-safe way of ensuring that you're not really burning out a single character by making them the focus of like the whole story.
So my question was like, most of the time in science fiction we see that, I mean, even as editor, and sometimes I try to write stories, that I see that it's there is a very interesting scientific concept in that story, and the story actually encapsulates the whole concept. But when the author is trying to tell the readers about that concept, it becomes very boring. So what is your take? How do you think that how it should be done? I mean, I have seen that people are like writing like for 1 page or 2 page, 2 persons are conversing about that concept, and through that concept is being introduced, but which I feel that quite boring, and people try to just omit those parts.
I think the person who does this best is Ted Chiang. You read this story is exhalation, right? You read the stories in that very complex scientific concepts. Not for a moment do you feel that you're being hit on the head with exposition. How he does it, like, I am studying him closely, I guess. But I would say that, if I was to, give you an example of someone who does it very well, it's Ted Chiang. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer this because I'm not, like, my work does not really focus on, like, hardcore science concepts. I mean, there's a little bit of it, but it's not the central piece. I would say that, my answer would there be, like, just read the ones who do it well. I think one is Ted Chiang, and I think, like, I think what he does is that he does it, like, in a very, very subtle way, right? So I think there was one like story in Exhalation about, like, the clockmaker, like, there was this, like, this thing, and it's like you actually don't know what the scientific concept is until the very last page, right? And that's because he's telling a story, right? And you are hooked into the story. It's only at the very end you learn, okay, this is what the science is. I think that may work often than, like, thrusting the science down your. I think what people feel, what the writers sometimes feel is that, oh, if I don't, like, explain the science, it won't make sense. I think the trick is to make it make sense without the science. And then as the story goes, you bring in the science bit by bit. Again, I would say this is not prescriptive, because I think, like, one writer who, for me, does, in fact, I think, exposition better than, like, even the rest of the work is Ian M. Banks, right? So in the culture series, the culture novels, I recommend them all, the brilliant novels, you will have suddenly, like, 5 pages of, like, exposition, but he's so good with that you get drawn into, like, he'll make the concept magical, right? Like, he'll make the concept come alive for you, whether it is, like, space travel or the cube or whatever he's doing. So I think, if you can make that science idea come alive for the reader, then go ahead, do exposition, because then you won't lose them. But if you're struggling with that, and if you're finding yourself forcing it, then maybe try the Ted Chiang way of, first asking yourself, okay, how can I make the story good without the science, and then bring in the science bit by bit. Yeah. Again, I'm the wrong person though, because I don't do that kind of writing, and I'm not qualified to do that kind of writing. But I think,
that makes sense actually.
But I found Exhalation to be, like, the sort of the example of how very complex science it just made so good. You never think you're in a science novel, right? Like, until the last page. So yes.
I want to ask about the issue of language during writing fiction. For example, sometimes many brilliant ideas may come to my mind, but when it comes into putting it into like coherent, artful and mellifluous language, it becomes complex. So what is your suggestion about improving language dexterity, keeping to the coherence of ideas and plot?
I mean, honestly, there is no solution to this. But what I would say is that there is a very common saying among writers that your first draft, it does not have to be good; it just has to exist, right? So your first draft can be terrible. It can be absolutely, like, useless, as long as you write it and you get the ideas down. So think of your first draft as just being the idea down in concrete terms on paper. And then, with each successive draft, you can start working on language and working on, like, expression and articulation. I think, again, that the two things that are, again, like, there's no I think answer here, but two things that help. One is, like I said, the ear test. So read out your, writing to yourself, see if it's, like, flowing in your own ear. And second is, and I think this is something we often underestimate, and this goes back to my earlier point about writing as a solitary activity. Have a circle of friends around you who will be both honest but not unkind. So they will tell you what is not working, and they will tell you what needs work, but not in a destructive way which sort of tears you down. So it's very difficult, like, sort of balance to draw. Either we will tell you, oh, like, you're fantastic, and that doesn't help at all, or they will be destructive, which also does not help. Neither of those two things help. You need that little balance of things. So I would say that, like, have those two things. And one more thing I think helps is that, okay, so any piece of writing will have its high points, and then drudgery. Like, so like part of it will be like drudgery, like there will be sections you don't want to write but they're essential to the novel. If you're struggling with language and just articulation of the ideas, ask yourself what is it you enjoy writing the most, right? So for some people it will be dialogue, so conversations. For some it will be action scenes, right? For some it might be like a sword fight, right? For some it might be a spaceship chase. For some it might be a courtroom scene, right? It depends on who you are. And then start with what you enjoy writing the most, right? So it might actually be chapter 17, section 2 of your final novel. You don't have to start from chapter 1, right? But if you know that, okay, look, like I enjoy writing dialogue the most, and there will be a part in my novel where the two protagonists will have like a very pivotal conversation which will turn the story. Write that first, right? And then you can see, then you'll begin to get into the flow of putting your ideas onto paper or the screen, and then that will help you with the more difficult parts. So if you ease into a place which you're confident of, you enjoy it, then the rest of it will then become also more effortless. It'll still be hard, but it'll be effortless. And yeah, the final thing is a very standard thing. Always edit, right? So keep editing your work all the time. As you're writing it, after you've written it, just keep on chipping away. And like I said, your first draft should not look anything like your final novel. It should be a world of difference between the two, and that is the language will come as you refine, bit by bit. Yes.
It's a kind of funny question. I wanted to ask, for readers who are not so much familiarized with the genre climate fiction, what kind of books would you suggest them to read in order to enjoy the science fiction genre more? You could, when you are writing science fiction, what kind of non-science fiction genres you took inspiration from? That's my question.
No, I read everything. I mean, whatever takes my fancy. So I don't think there's a genre that specifically I would say inspired me in a non-SF genre which inspired me to write SF. I think you never know what will impact you in what way. So in my work, I mean, there's some of the more interesting history books I've read play a part. History is always a big thing. Books about poetry and verse, and all kinds of stuff. So I think I think that in that sense, I couldn't pinpoint one genre which I'd say informed my science fiction work. But I will say, I think there are two things. I think one is that it is important to read outside the genre, because then you're not confined to it. But I think it is, as a writer, if you intend to write genre, you need to know it very, very well, because a lot of things have been done multiple times, right? So if you're writing a novel with a robot in it, you need to know that for the last 70 years, people have written novels with robots in them, and you can't reinvent the wheel now. So you have to, and I'm not saying you have to sort of be familiar with every single work produced, but you have to have a sense of the ideas that have been debated in the genre and where things stand right now, in order to do something fresh, right? And in fact, if you look at, for example, Clarkesworld magazine, one of the prominent magazines of genre in the world, they have a set of guidelines of what not to submit, and you'll see stuff like werewolf, zombie stuff. It's stuff that's been now done for 200 years, right? So yeah, you potentially can still write a fresh werewolf story, but it's very, very hard to say something new and interesting about werewolves now. So I think I would say read both outside the genre, but also don't ignore the genre when you're setting out to be a writer in it. Anything else?
May I ask another question?
Yes.
Almost all of us are aspiring writers here, and I'd like to ask you about how important it is to find agents to get published, especially outside India. I'd like to ask you about this.
Outside India, routes you can take. One is what they call trad publishing, to traditional publishing, which is publishing with a publishing house, and the other is independent publishing. Right? So, indie publishing means that you basically write your novel, you upload it to Amazon, and then you market it yourself. If you are going the indie route, then you don't need an agent. Obviously, it's your own thing. But then you have to be an ace marketer, right? So you are basically marketing like your book. There are stories of people who have gone from like becoming indie sensations to then like being picked up by publishers. People can make a good career out of that. So if marketing and sales is if you're confident about that, if you do your research, then you don't need an agent to go indie, right? Most of us don't have that, right? Like, I mean, I am a writer and not a marketer. I can't market my own books. I don't have the skills for that. It's like its own craft, right? So why would I go indie? Because I know I'll fail, right? So I won't do that. If you want to be published traditionally, then you do need an agent, because almost all the publishing houses will not accept non-agented manuscripts. There are exceptions. So, for example, Solaris's online imprint, it's called Solaris Nova, for example, does accept from time to time unsolicited manuscripts. You can do that. Certain like publishing houses will have submission periods where it's okay, like from August 1st to like August 20th, we're accepting unagented submissions. Angry Robot is an example. So it is possible. It is very, very hard, and your life will become much, much easier if you find an agent. So I would say that if you want to write novels that are published in the West, 99% you will need an agent for that. And to find an agent, you should go to querytracker.com and filter with your genre, and you will find a list of agents who work in your field. These agents all have what they call MSWL, which is manuscript wish list, which they'll tell you like what they're looking for, right? So if you're writing like a dystopia, you don't want to query a romantasy agent, right? So they will tell you there that, look, I'm looking for XYZ, and my favorite novels are XYZ, right? So that's how you find out who to query. And then there's a whole other bunch of things involving pitching and so on, which we can talk about later. Like that's a longer conversation, but that's a publishing conversation, right? So how do you go about doing that is a whole different thing, and I'm happy to talk about that, like with you outside of, or anyone who wants to talk about that, to discuss it separately. Long story short is that you will need an agent most cases for writing abroad, and you find them on querytracker.com. That's where they all are listed. It's very easy now. Actually, earlier it was much harder. You have to find them on listings and so on, send physical. Now it's all one database, all online. You query online. The process is much easier. Of course, like getting an agent is much harder, but the process of querying is now like a lot easier. Again, also one more thing is that an agent will not guarantee you a publishing deal, right? Like so, that's still like one more step after that.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time, so this is the last one. Okay.
So, sir, as a writer, specifically in the science fiction genre and more specifically in climate fiction, how do you and where do you posit facts and information? And how do you think of knowledge in that genre, and how important the factuality or the information do you think is it in this genre, and how?
Science fiction is always based upon a kernel of fact, right? So it'll take some concept and it'll take something and work with that. Now, to what extent it plays a role, depends upon the nature of the novel you're writing, right? So if you're writing a far future novel set 3,000 years in the future, obviously you can take a lot more liberties, with what you're doing. In fact, Arthur Clarke had a term for it, science fantasy, right? So you can take like a concept, but then you can really run with it to a point where basically fantasy, right? So there's of course, if you're doing something closer to the present, and you want to communicate something that is about our world, then you will of course need to be more thorough with your facts. But again, how you weave them into the story, well, I think again the thing is to keep in mind that your first commitment is to telling a good story, right? So your first commitment is not to communicating some fact to your reader, right? So if you use the vehicle of science fiction to basically expound on facts, you will write a very bad novel, a very bad story. And one problem that Indian SF had for a long time was that it was treating, in English at least, or in fact other languages, it was treating fiction as a way of science education. Now that is not, people will not read you in that case because it's going to be a very dull story. So your first commitment is to writing a good story, and then you ask yourself, okay, how do I weave in the facts? I'll give you an example, right? So one of my favorite recent science fiction novels was the one that won the Arthur Clarke Award 2 years ago, novel called Venomous Lumpsucker. And what this novel did was it took this idea of carbon credits, right? So companies can pay to pollute, and extended that to what they call extinction credits, right? In the novel, so you can pay if you want, if your activities will make a species extinct, right? Then you can pay and basically get a credit and then go ahead and do that. Very bleak and obviously all that. But what they did was they took something that's part of our lives right now, carbon credits, and okay, this is where it will go in a few years, if you're not careful. So in that way, yes, you are using facts about our life, but your story, is not necessarily reducible to present day facts. You can also extrapolate. And I think that's when actually science fiction is most effective, and climate fiction, right? Because you are not being told about your world right now, but you can see how you would get there, right? And that's sort of the role that facts play, because you can anchor what you're reading in some fact without it being about that fact. So are we out of time?